Welcome back to the Constitutional Clarion. My last video concerned the history of proposals to elect governors and governors-general and how this might be relevant to a future republic. A number of comments on that video suggested, perhaps facetiously, that it would be a uniquely Australian approach to instead choose the head of state by way of lottery. So, for example, we could have Gov Lotto rather than Tats Lotto. But is it a uniquely Australian approach? This triggered a memory for me of writing a paper quite a long time ago for the Commonwealth Parliamentary Research Service, in fact in 1993, on the various methods of choosing a head of state. In that paper I included a short section on what's called sortition, and that means the method of choosing by lottery. Now, before I get outrage comments from people telling me I must desist forthwith from even impliedly suggesting that the head of state be chosen in this way, may I just point out that I'm not advocating it, I'm just explaining the history of sortition and how it might be reused here, because I think it's quite interesting, and hopefully you will too. The ancient Athenians, who pioneered a form of democracy, used sortition as a means of achieving fairness and the equality of citizens. Now this was of course quite a limited form of equality, as many people didn't even qualify as citizens. Women and slaves, for example, were excluded. To be qualified, to be chosen under this system, one had to be a male citizen over 30 years old. Sortition was then used to appoint people to offices where their role was to be representative of the people, such as being members of juries. Other officers, such as military leaders, where particular skills were required, were chosen by election or other means so that the best skilled person got the job. You can see references to sortition in Plato's The Republic, which is, by the way, a very good read, and also Aristotle's The Politics, although neither of them go into sortition in any great detail. Sortition was regarded as democratic because it avoided the risk of the wealthy corruptly buying office. Qualified citizens would nominate themselves, and if they were selected by this rather marvellous device called a cleritarian, although I've probably mispronounced that, they were then subject to examination on matters such as their character before they could take up their office. This random distribution of power, together with checks and balances, was regarded as significantly reducing the risks of oppression or corruption by the leaders in the political system. Every citizen could also level accusations of misconduct or unworthiness against a person who had been chosen by lot, resulting in their suspension if they did not meet the required standards. Sortition was used centuries later in Venice in the process for electing the Doge of Venice from 1268 for about 500 years. But it was used primarily as a means of choosing those who actually did the electing of the Doge in order to reduce control by noble families and to prevent political manipulation. The process was layered in chance at many different stages to achieve that outcome. I'm taking this description from the magnificent work by John Julius Norwich called A History of Venice. My husband was actually so entranced by it as he was rereading it recently, that he read out this particular passage at the dinner table last week, which also prompted this particular video. Now, it's quite a long passage, but it is worth it, so listen on. On the day appointed for the election, the youngest member of the Signoria, which was the Inner Council of State, was to pray at St. Mark's. Then, on leaving the basilica, he was to stop the first boy that he met and take him to the Doge's palace, where the Great Council, minus those of its members who were under 30, was to be in full session. The boy, known as the ballottino, would have the duty of picking the slips of paper from the urn during the drawing of lots. By the first of such lots, the council chose 30 of their own number. The second was used to reduce 30 to 9, and the 9 would then vote for 40, each of whom was to receive at least 7 nominations. The 40 would then be reduced again by lot to 12, whose task was to vote for 25, of whom each was this time required to have 9 votes. The 25 were in turn reduced to another 9. The 9 voted for 45 with a minimum of 7 votes each, and from these the ballottino picked out the names of 11. The 11 now voted for 41, 9 or more votes each, and it was these 41 who were to elect the Doge. They first attended Mass and individually swore an oath that they would act honestly and uprightly for the good of the Republic. They were then locked in secret conclave in the palace, cut off from all contact or communication with the outside world, and guarded by a special force of sailors day and night until their work was done. Now, you might think that that was the end of the story, but that was just the preliminaries. According to Norwich, the procedure for election of the Doge then proceeded as follows. Each elector wrote the name of his candidate on a paper and dropped it in the urn. The slips were removed and read, and a list was drawn up of all the names proposed, regardless of the number of nominations for each. A single slip for each name was now placed in another urn and one drawn. If the candidate concerned was present, he retired, together with any other elector who bore the same surname, and the remainder proceeded to discuss his suitability. He was then called back to answer questions or to defend himself against any accusations. A ballot followed. If he obtained the required 25 votes, he was declared Doge. Otherwise, a second name was drawn, and so on. Now, by anyone's measure, that was probably rather overdone. Norwich quotes a British ambassador to Venice as claiming that the procedure had been invented by a Benedictine monk who probably had been involved in a little too much cloistered scheming. But you can see the point of it. It included so much chance as to make corruption exceedingly difficult, but it also provided an ultimate choice based upon assessments of merit. Florence also used lottery as part of its process for choosing its members of the Signoria and later the Great Council in the 12th and 13th centuries. In the Enlightenment period, both Montesquieu in his book The Spirit of the Laws and also Rousseau in The Social Contract considered that sortition as a means of choosing office holders was more natural to democracy than election. Both were concerned, however, that there be some way of avoiding the selection of those who are incompetent or foolish or corrupt. Neither was sufficiently enthusiastic about sortition, however, to have influenced the American colonies or the European countries to revive it, although it was used for a period in Spain on the basis that it prevented power from being monopolised by a small group, limited electoral fraud, reduced corruption, and appeased internal conflicts. The Spanish drew on the Venetian customs of drawing names on slips of paper from an urn and using a child to do so. Sortition in Australia has been used for choosing juries in criminal trials and ballots for conscription during war. It's also used for citizens' assemblies or citizens' juries, both in Australia and abroad, to address contentious political issues, sometimes even including constitutional reform. Bodies such as New Democracy in Australia run citizens' assemblies based upon random selection of participants. Could we use sortition as an element in choosing an Australian head of state, both under the current constitutional system and in a republic? The key problem here is that the role of the head of state is not just one of being representative of the nation. It requires certain skills and personality traits that are not necessarily universally held. For example, heads of state need to be able to make speeches at the drop of a hat. In my experience, the vast bulk of the population has an absolute horror of public speaking and would not be able to cope with that aspect of the role. Another part of the job is to meet and converse with all incoming foreign ambassadors as well as visiting heads of state. Again, many people wouldn't feel sufficiently experienced and equipped to be able to do that adequately as a representative of their country. A third requirement is to have an outgoing personality, which allows the person to converse happily with everyone from school children to community groups to politicians and people in remote areas. It also requires a huge amount of tact and self-abnegation so that one doesn't say anything controversial. Sir Philip Game, a former governor of New South Wales, and ultimately a controversial one, wrote to his mother-in-law to say that at the end of the day, when he and his wife were touring country towns, he found that his face was frozen into a Richter smile from being required to smile at people all day. It's not a job for an introvert or anyone who is inclined to speak their mind, or indeed anyone who doesn't have the internal discipline to show absolute delight at every social interaction and every event. Grumpiness is not permitted. Finally, there remains the political, legal and constitutional aspects of the job. While vice-regal officers are primarily required to act upon ministerial advice, they are not automatons. Under the Westminster system, they have what Bagehot described as the right to be consulted, to encourage and to warn. If something looks dodgy in the material that comes before the Governor-General and Executive Council, the Governor-General is entitled to raise concerns, to delay approval, and to seek Crown legal advice as to the validity of the matter. In doing this, vice-regal officers sometimes pick up errors, which are then corrected. They therefore fill a vital extra check on government action. They can also act as an early warning indicator of possible corruption. If a vice-regal officer raises concern about particular action, a government will ordinarily review it and think twice before insisting that the vice-regal officer approve it. Now, some will inevitably raise in the comments that the Governor-General did not appear to pick up on and query Prime Minister Morrison's appointment to multiple ministries. But the opportunity was there to do so, and if concerns had been raised, it might not have continued in that secretive manner for so long. I've certainly been told by numerous vice-regal officers about how they have raised concerns about the legality or propriety of matters, and that this did cause the government to act to rectify the position or change their approach. Of course, it's all done behind closed doors, so the public don't see it. But to be successful in fulfilling that role, a vice-regal officer needs, on the one hand, a good understanding of legal and governmental matters to know when to intervene, as well as a degree of gravitas and respect so that the Prime Minister pays attention and thinks twice. Hence, you need a very particular type of person to fulfil the role of Governor-General, or in a republic, Head of State. Choosing a person randomly by way of lottery would therefore not be a good approach. However, if you had a pool of appropriately qualified people, then you could use sortition as a means of choosing from amongst them. Back in the 1970s, W.C. Wentworth, obviously not the same one that influenced the New South Wales Constitution in the 1850s, there's been a few W.C. Wentworths. Anyway, in the 1970s, W.C. Wentworth suggested that you could have a system where the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition nominated a panel of 4 or 5 people who would all be acceptable to both of them, with the final selection then being made by lot. Building on the previous video that I did about electing the Governor-General, another approach would be to take the pool of current state governors who have all been performing the vice-regal role at the state level, and take the names of those who would be prepared to serve as Governor-General, put them in an urn, or, hey, you could use the Melbourne Cup or some other suitably Australian receptacle, and have a young child pull out the name of the person to serve as the next head of state. Not all of the state governors would necessarily want a term as Governor-General or head of state due to age or other family commitments, but no doubt some of them would be prepared to do so as a matter of public service. While this method would deny the people a vote on the matter, it would have some advantages. First, it would ensure that the Prime Minister did not get to choose the Governor-General. This is important both for avoiding the risk or perception of corruption, patronage and undue influence, and to ensure that the Governor-General retains the kind of independent status that gives value to their role in encouraging and warning. It's even more important if there is a constitutional crisis. If the head of state were to be dismissed in a crisis, then the Prime Minister would not be able to control who would then be the replacement. Indeed, you could also use that body of existing state governors as a kind of council whose agreement would be required before the head of state could be dismissed by the Prime Minister. Second, it would negate the argument used at the 1999 referendum that this was a stitch-up by politicians in Canberra who could choose a crony or lackey as head of state. Federal politicians would have no control over the candidates or indeed the outcome by lot. Third, it would mean that eminent and worthy people who would never stand for election could still be chosen as head of state. When the Australian people discuss who they would like to see as head of state of a republic, they mostly want the type of people that we commonly have as governors and governors-general. People like Sir William Dean or Dame Quentin Bryce or Sir Peter Cosgrove or Dame Marie Bashir. But these are precisely the type of people who would never stand for election. Sortition, drawing from an existing pool of people already performing the role at the state level, would allow such non-partisan eminent Australians to be chosen. The fourth advantage is that it would also increase the chances of people from smaller jurisdictions becoming head of state. At the moment, it tends to be persons who are well known to the Prime Minister, who tends to move in limited geographical circles. Sortition, with candidates drawn from each of the states and perhaps also the administrator of the Northern Territory, would widen the prospective pool, making it more federal in nature. Again, I'm not advocating or pushing any particular proposal or even a republic at this stage. I'm just drawing on history to see how ideas from it could be adopted in the future if Australia were to become a republic. Thank you once again for watching. I hope you learnt something new and that it made you think. And as always, I look forward to seeing you again next time. Goodbye.